The mystical truths in religions East and West are brought to light again and made relevant for our time by Elizabeth Clare Prophet, world-renowned author and spiritual teacher.
With all this talk about doing the right thing and following God's will, I think the question for most people is, how do you know what God's will is? I mean, in the face of all the conflicting vibrations with which we're all confronted in the world today.
Doug, I have always found that God will never fail to reveal himself to us if we persistently seek him. The answer to the question, how do you know God's will, is simply ask. Ask God, God, what is your will for me today? And when you have asked, then you go about your daily duties. And you find that in the alchemy of the day, in its unfoldment, in the blending of forces, in the movement of your mind with the mind of God, God reveals his will not so much by a spoken word, but by the very action of his Spirit in and through us. And that will is like the unfolding rose. It unfolds like a spiral, and we come to understand it proportionately as we keep ourselves attuned to the mind of God, and as we keep active, doing the best we know how to do each day for him, for our family, and for our community.
Then how can you put this knowledge to work for alchemy and for change in your life?
Do you mean the will of God?
Yes.
The will of God is power. When you are aligned with the will of God, it's like having two colanders. You're a colander and God is a colander. You put the two together, you get the holes lined up, and then the cosmic energy of the universe flows through those holes, and you find yourself literally charged and bristling with God's energy. As soon as you're out of alignment with God's will, it's like your colander has moved, and there's a total block to the flow, and you don't know what to do with yourself, you don't know what to do with your life. So if we find ourselves in that predicament of not knowing which way to go, we have to pause a moment, and maybe for a day or longer, and say, if I really don't have the fulfillment in my life that I'm seeking, it has to be because of this one factor. Somewhere along the way, I have gotten out of alignment with the will of God. In a series of pearls of wisdom which we are releasing to our students, Saint Germain reveals the path of freedom and how to get back into alignment with the will of God. And in those pearls, he reveals his own guru, the Great Divine Director. The Great Divine Director's causal body, or sphere of cosmic consciousness, as you might say, contains the energy concentration for that divine direction. He keeps the flame, in other words, for divine direction for life on earth. Saint Germain teaches us then how to give certain mantras and decrees to the flame of divine direction, which is in the heart of the Great Divine Director. By doing a special series of these mantras and decrees daily, one comes into a greater alignment with that cosmic consciousness which is held by the Great Divine Director. I would encourage then that those who are listening to us today, who are seeking divine direction, the will of God, and that alchemy of self-transformation which Saint Germain actually learned from his guru, write to us for these pearls of wisdom. We would be most happy to share with you this bread from the Lord's table.
Once we've identified the will of God, and once we've made up our minds that it's going to be our will, what's the next step?
Things really start happening when you decide that the will of God is the center of your life. Saint Germain describes his contact with one or more life streams on earth, and he talks also about Jesus visiting his disciples even in this age. The fact remains that the moment you can say, "Not my will, but thine be done," with a full understanding that you have free will to accept or reject God's will, then you realize that that is all that the ascended masters are waiting for. When you accept God's will, as Jesus did in Gethsemane, immediately an angel comes and ministers unto you as it ministered unto him. These angels are angles of God's consciousness personified as the ascended masters. We find then that the will of God is what will give us conscious cooperation with the invisible world and with the invisible hierarchy. Saint Germain tells us that the creation of the visible is wholly dependent upon those essences which are not visible to the unaided eye. This is a very important point in alchemy. It means to draw forth from the universal, from the energies of spirit. We must be able to visualize these realms and establish contact with them. Because we have not yet mastered time and space, we do not come and go in infinity as the ascended masters do. However, since we have need of the energies, the resources of infinity to take dominion over the earth, the next best thing is to make contact with those who have access to those resources. It's like when you need money, you go to the bank for a loan. You go to the place where there is that resource. So, Saint Germain says that in the process of alchemy, we should follow the path of what he calls enlightened self-interest. Enlightened self-interest is interest in the self, the real self, the God self. But he explains to us that this is not selfishness, but it is actually what is best for and good for the self. He says that unless we pursue this enlightened self-interest, we will never be able to do the things which Jesus did. Before Jesus became the Master of Galilee, he studied until the age of 30 in the retreats of the Great White Brotherhood these very laws of alchemy. Having mastered those laws before that embodiment, brushing up on that sacred science before his mission, he became the greatest alchemist of all time. Saint Germain is saying, if you are going to help the world, help yourself first and do it according to the teachings of alchemy which I am giving you. He explains that ignorance with its defilement of the law deprives the individual and society of enlightenment. The only cure is illumined obedience, together with scientific attentiveness to the detail of the law. Illumined obedience is when we seek to understand God's will, to know that it is good, to know that it is really the foundation and the structure of our identity. And when we can, by conscious free will, accept that law, not by becoming a zombie or a puppet on the string, not by simply becoming a jellyfish, but by becoming a very strong individual and then yielding that strength to the creativity of the mind of God.
Some people use their subconscious minds to enhance their creativity. What does Saint Germain have to say about this?
Saint Germain teaches us that the sincere student who would ponder and practice methods of mind and memory control, which are the methods of God himself, should acquire the habit of consciously giving to the blessed higher mind, or Christ self, the responsibility for designing and perfecting the embryonic ideas and patterns of his creation. He says that many of these patterns, which at first appear to be consciously conceived by the alchemist, frequently have their origin within this higher portion of the blessed self. He explains to us that 24 hours a day, the higher mind is active in expanded dimensions. We are not always aware of what this higher mind is doing, but if we meditate upon something that we desire to draw forth, even wisdom itself, and we release that as a matrix into the higher mind, especially before we retire at night, that in the morning we are filled with inspiration and divine direction. And so Saint Germain counsels us that it is very important as we pursue the studies in alchemy that we have a pad of paper and a pencil next to our beds so that if we are awakened in the night, we will write down immediately what we are thinking and what the higher mind is impressing upon us, because invariably we will forget when we awaken in the morning. This is because those moments, which occur often in the middle of the night, are moments of a higher contact and an experience in higher consciousness. And so often we say, well, we'll pick it up in the morning, but in the morning we never remember because we are not capable of sustaining in our full waking consciousness this contact with the inner mind. We find then that the great alchemist himself, God, the Almighty One, is working in and with and through our soul from the superconscious mind of the highest source to the subconscious mind that contains all of the memory of our own past achievement in previous incarnations. Alchemy then becomes the science of a total integration of the soul with the forces of his own microcosm, his own being, and as that being is in contact with the one universal source. Saint Germain gives a great deal of instruction on alchemy before he releases a basic outline of how to pursue the process. He says, first design a mental matrix of the desired object. Then determine where you wish it to manifest. If you know the material substance of which it is composed, memorize its atomic pattern. If not, call to the divine intelligence within your higher mind to register the pattern for you from the universal intelligence and to impress it upon your memory body and your mind. Recognize that light is an energy substance universally manifesting on earth, thanks to the sun's center of being, the focal point of the Christ in this solar system. Saint Germain continues, call for light to take on the atomic pattern you are holding, to coalesce around that pattern, and then to densify into form. Call for the multiplication of this atomic structure until molecules of substance begin to fill the void, occupying the space in which you desire the object to appear. When the total outline is filled with a vibratory action of the fourth dimensional substance representing the desired manifestation, ask for the full lowering of the atomic density into three-dimensional form and substance within the pattern established by the matrix of your mind, and then await results. There is a real core of information in Saint Germain's writings for the individual who perceives himself as a part of the avant-garde who will carry Earth's evolution from the old order to the new. The symbol of this new order of the ages which Saint Germain is sponsoring is the eye in the capstone of the pyramid that appears on the $1 bill. That eye is the all-seeing eye of the inner alchemist, your own higher mind, your own real self. When you make contact with that inner eye of God, then you can precipitate the great pyramid of self and find yourself one with a cosmos.
Thank you very much.
This is a presentation of the Summit Lighthouse, an international spiritual organization dedicated to universal enlightenment. Founded in 1958, the Summit Lighthouse is a beacon of truth to thousands worldwide and a leader in New Thought spirituality.